This is bad. This is bad. Stephanie White, Caitlin Clark, bumping heads on the sideline. Stephanie White showing up her star player on the bench, saying, "Get the F out of your seat. Raven Johnson, take her spot." Stephanie White is an abomination. An absolute abomination.
Oh, you already know why you clicked on this video. You already know. You saw that clip, you sent it to your group chat, you replayed it 3 times, and now you're here because you need somebody to actually sit down and break down what we just watched happen in Portland on Saturday night. Well, you came to the right place because I am Dre Fiver. This is Street Hoops, and today we are going all the way in. No filter, no spin, no corporate media softening the edges to protect feelings. Because what happened on that bench at the Moda Center was not normal. That was not a routine coaching moment. That was not 2 competitive basketball minds hashing out strategy during a timeout. That was a public rupture. And depending on which lens you're looking through, it is either the first visible crack in a relationship that was always one bad night away from fracturing, or it is the loudest, most unavoidable symptom of a dysfunction that has been festering inside the Indiana Fever organization all season long. On this channel, we call it what it is. So let's get into it. Let me set the scene properly, because context is everything, and I'm not going to let the casual viewer walk away without the full picture. Indiana Fever versus Portland Fire. Saturday, May 30th, 2026. The Indiana Fever walked into the Moda Center as a 12-point favorite. 12 points. Against an expansion team in their very first season of existence. A team that had never played a WNBA regular season game before this year. And if you needed any more context on the weight of what that number means, understand this. The Fever entered the 2026 season with legitimate championship expectations. Caitlin Clark was back healthy after a 2025 campaign that was essentially stolen from her. A season where she played in just 13 games while the basketball world held its collective breath, wondering if Indiana's window was quietly closing before it ever fully opened. This was supposed to be the year. The full roster, the full Clark, the full-throttle Indiana Fever charging toward a title that the fan base, the league, and every media outlet on the planet believed was not just possible but probable. That was the expectation. That is what Stephanie White signed up to deliver. What did the Fever actually give us on Saturday night? They dropped a 100-84 blowout loss to the Portland Fire. 16 points. To an expansion team. Indiana fell to 4-4 on the season, their second consecutive defeat after getting beat by Golden State on Thursday. Now, before we even get to the bench incident, let's just dwell in that result for a moment, because it matters enormously to everything that followed. At one point during that game, Portland led by as many as 26 points, 26, as a 12-point underdog, in their own building, against a Fever team that was supposed to be a title contender. And here is the detail that really stings. Portland got a game-high 22 points from Megan Gustafson, and 2 of their players, Carla Leite and Emily Engstler, both recorded double-doubles on the same night against this supposedly elite Indiana defense. That is a systemic defensive collapse. That is not a bad night. That is a team that does not know how to guard anybody when the game gets hard. And that defensive identity problem, that structural failure on that end of the floor, sits at the very center of the argument that erupted on the bench between Caitlin Clark and Stephanie White. Now here is exactly what happened, frame by frame, because I've watched this clip more times than I care to admit, and I need you to see it the way Dre sees it. During a second-quarter timeout, with the game already getting away from Indiana, Stephanie White gets visibly animated on the bench, pointing directly at Clark multiple times, slapping her own knee in frustration, clearly unloading on her star guard about something defensive. According to every lip reader, every broadcaster, and every pundit who has weighed in since Saturday night, the argument was about Clark's defensive positioning. White was apparently telling Clark to go straight up on her matchup instead of reaching, to stay in front, to move her feet. The discussion was heated from White's side immediately. And Clark? Clark did something that either earns your respect or makes your blood boil. She sat there calm as a lake, water bottle in hand, staring straight ahead, not making eye contact, not nodding, not engaging. Just absorbing it, or more precisely, appearing to consciously refuse to absorb it. That non-response from Clark, that tells you everything about where these two were in that moment emotionally. But the calm didn't last. Clark eventually reached her limit and threw both hands up in her own animated response. And that was the moment. That was the trigger. Whatever Clark said in that exchange was enough for Stephanie White to make the call. She gestured for rookie Raven Johnson to come over and take the active bench seat, effectively pulling Clark from the rotation in real time, in the middle of a timeout, in front of a national television audience. And Clark did not accept it quietly. She stood up, shook her head, and made a visible show of walking away from the bench area with her frustration fully on display for anyone watching. The clip went viral within hours. 16,000 views in the first wave, and climbing hard, the basketball internet has not stopped talking about it since. Now let me give you the full game context because I want to be thorough here. Clark's night was already going sideways before the bench confrontation happened. She picked up foul trouble early. Her second foul came before the first quarter was even over, and Stephanie White pulled her at the 6:30 mark of the opening quarter. At that point, the Fever were actually leading 8-4 and getting into a rhythm. Clark, Aaliyah Boston, and Lexi Hull all came out of the game at the same time, and Portland immediately went on a 13-2 run. By the time the first quarter ended, the Fire had turned an 8-4 Indiana lead into a 29-15 Portland lead, a 25-7 swing, in 3.5 minutes. And that first quarter substitution decision, pulling Clark, Boston, and Hull simultaneously while the team was rolling, became its own major controversy before the bench incident even happened. After the game, Stephanie White was asked about pulling Clark and Boston that early. Her explanation was essentially that this was the team's standard rotation pattern, that Aaliyah Boston is still on a minutes restriction, and that taking Clark out at that point in the first quarter had been the normal approach all season. She acknowledged that she deviated from it in the Golden State game because she did not want Raven Johnson in that environment without another ball handler on the floor. And that answer, that explanation, did not land well. At all. Fans flooded social media with fury. One wrote that pulling those players made zero sense and the game was basically lost in that moment. Another said a coach needs to be adjusting on the fly, not running scripted rotations when her team is building momentum against an expansion franchise. And honestly, they have a point. You are up 8-4. Your best player has 3 assists in the first 3.5 minutes. She is locked in, the crowd energy is building. And you pull her because the script says so? That is not adjusting to the moment. That is coaching from a clipboard instead of from the floor. But the rotation decisions were just the first layer. The bench argument is the headline. And after the game, when Clark went to the microphone, she added fuel to an already raging fire. Clark said publicly, and I want you to understand how significant it is that she said this publicly, that she felt the team's rotations were a little bit slow, particularly in the third quarter when Portland outscored Indiana by 12 points in the period. She said she hopes the rotations are a little bit quicker going forward. Now read between those lines. Caitlin Clark, in a post-game press conference, is publicly critiquing her head coach's substitution timing. She is not screaming. She is not going scorched earth. She is measured and professional. But she is absolutely, deliberately on record saying the rotations cost them. And then Stephanie White was asked directly about Clark's comments. White responded by saying, and I'm paraphrasing her words here, that she does not know if foul trouble has a lot to do with rotations, and that the real issue is anticipation. White separately acknowledged after the game that not having Clark on the floor for the majority of the game due to foul trouble was a massive disadvantage, stating it is tough when your primary ball handler is in foul trouble. So on one hand, White admits Clark's absence hurt them. On the other hand, she deflects the rotation critique by pointing at foul trouble and anticipation rather than acknowledging that her scripted lineup decisions opened the door for a catastrophic momentum swing. You cannot have it both ways. And that is the tension that nobody in the mainstream wants to address directly. So Dre is going to do it. The foul trouble narrative and the rotation narrative are not mutually exclusive. They are intertwined. Because here is the dirty truth about Caitlin Clark's foul trouble in this league. A significant portion of it is manufactured. Clark gets hunted defensively by opposing offenses in isolation sets because teams have figured out that she is the Fever's only reliable ball handler. And if you can get her into foul trouble early, you change the entire geometry of how Indiana can play. Every coach in the WNBA knows this. It is not a secret. It is a documented, exploited strategy. Portland's coaching staff knew it coming in. So when Stephanie White pulled Clark at 6:30 in the first quarter with 2 fouls, and Portland immediately went on a 13-2 run, what that exposed was not just that Clark was in foul trouble, it exposed that Indiana has no functional answer at the point guard position when Clark cannot be on the floor. And that is a roster construction problem. That is a coaching and front office problem. That is not Caitlin Clark's problem. Now let's talk about Raven Johnson, because Johnson has been positioned by some corners of the basketball commentary world as the potential answer to Indiana's guard depth issues. The 10th overall pick in the 2026 WNBA draft out of South Carolina, 2-time NCAA champion SEC Defensive Player of the Year. On paper, she looks like exactly what you want in a backup point guard, somebody who can defend, distribute, and take some pressure off Clark. And look, Dre is not here to bury Raven Johnson. She is a rookie. She is going to have growing pains. But here is the inconvenient reality from Saturday night. Johnson was inserted into the game in Clark's place after the bench confrontation, and she did not solve the problem. She could not. Because the problem is not about which individual guard is on the floor. The problem is that Indiana's defensive system has structural holes in it that no individual player is going to patch by herself. And when Stephanie White benched Clark in apparent frustration over defensive lapses and replaced her with a rookie who also could not stop the bleeding, what exactly did that accomplish? The scoreboard did not improve. The rotations did not tighten. The lead did not shrink. Portland kept attacking, kept scoring, kept pushing the lead out to 26 at its peak. Benching Clark in that moment was not a tactical adjustment that changed the game. It was a statement. And statements made in anger during a blowout loss are worth analyzing very carefully. The basketball legends weighed in within 24 hours, and their reactions were notable, not just for what they said, but for the split in how they framed it. Cheryl Miller looked at the clip and said the emotions were simply the product of frustration boiling over between two highly competitive people who want the same thing. She acknowledged that while this kind of tension happens at the highest levels of competition, having it spill over into a visible public moment during a game is not a good look, and that when a coach reaches the point of pulling a player from the bench mid-timeout, that is the coach drawing a line. Miller made it clear she understood why White made the call she made. Sue Bird offered a slightly different perspective, urging people not to read too deeply into a single sideline exchange, and noting that she personally had moments like that with her own coaches during her career. Bird said the exchange was not that crazy, that it speaks to the nature of player-coach relationships at the elite level, where competitive fire and tactical disagreements sometimes overflow into visible moments that look worse than they are in context. And look, Dre respects both of those takes. They are thoughtful, they are measured. They come from two people who have lived in that environment and understand what it feels like from the inside. But here is where I part ways with the mainstream narrative that is forming around this story. The mainstream narrative wants to wrap this up in a bow and call it competitive passion and move on. The mainstream narrative wants to say this is normal, it means nothing, Clark and White are fine, the Fever are fine, this is just how elite sports works. And maybe that is true. Maybe this ends here, but there are too many layers for Dre to just let it go at that. Think about the full arc of what happened in that game. First, White pulls her three best players simultaneously in the first quarter while the team is winning, triggering a 25-7 Portland run that effectively ended the contest before it ever really got going. Second, Clark gets into foul trouble that was predictable, and that opposing coaches are specifically engineering, and Indiana has no answer at point guard without her. Third, during a second quarter timeout, White publicly dresses down Clark on the bench in front of a national audience over defense. Clark pushes back, and White responds by moving Clark out of her active bench seat and inserting a rookie. Fourth, Clark finishes with 6 points on 1 for 7 shooting, 22 minutes of play, 5 fouls. Her worst performance of the season. Fifth, Clark goes to the post-game podium and publicly calls out the rotation timing. Sixth, White responds by deflecting the rotation critique rather than owning it. Tell me how any single one of those things is not a problem. Tell me how the sum total of those 6 events in one game does not represent something worth examining with a critical eye. And here is the part that Dre cannot stop thinking about. Clark is averaging 20.1 points per game this season and leads the entire WNBA in assists at 8.1 per game. She is the engine. She is the reason anybody is watching Indiana Fever basketball at a level that generates sold-out arenas and national television deals. The Fever entered this game as 12-point favorites because Clark makes them a contender. Without her, this team is a 500 team at best, potentially worse. And the franchise knows it, White knows it. Everyone in that building knows it. So when the dynamic on that bench looks like what it looked like Saturday night, when the star player is being publicly disciplined over defensive rotations by the same coach whose first quarter scripted substitution opened the door for a 13-2 run, the question of accountability becomes uncomfortably directional. I am not saying Stephanie White hates Caitlin Clark. I am not going that far. That is tabloid brain. And even on this channel, we deal in facts mixed with our perspective rather than fantasy. But I am saying this. The relationship between these two is clearly under strain in a way that goes beyond a one-game explosion of competitive frustration. The pressure of underachieving against championship expectations, the pressure of navigating Clark's injury history and load management, the pressure of a fan base that has zero patience for excuses when the best player in the world is on your roster and you are 4-4 through 8 games. All of that pressure has to go somewhere. And on Saturday night in Portland, it went directly onto that bench in front of the entire world. What happens next matters enormously. The Fever host Angel Reese and the Atlanta Dream on June 4th at Gainbridge Fieldhouse. That is the next test. That game will tell us a tremendous amount about the temperature inside that locker room and on that sideline. If Indiana comes out sharp, if Clark gets her minutes managed intelligently, if the rotations are quicker in the third quarter the way Clark publicly requested, if White demonstrates that she heard the critique and adjusted, then maybe this really is just a bad night that gets filed under the competitive friction category and forgotten within a week. But if the Fever come out flat again, if Clark is still getting pulled on script in the first quarter, while Indiana is building momentum, if the defensive rotations are still slow and the lead is still surrendered before halftime, then we are going to have a very different conversation. And Dre will be right here to have it. Because here is the bottom line that the mainstream media is dancing around. The Indiana Fever have championship talent and championship expectations. They have the most marketable player in women's basketball history on their roster, healthy and in her prime. They have front office investment. They have fan base energy. They have everything you need. What they do not have right now is a coherent identity on the defensive end. They do not have a functional backup point guard who changes games. They do not have a coaching performance from Stephanie White that justifies the blind faith the organization has placed in her rotation decisions. And they do not have the appearance of a calm, unified bench when things go sideways in a nationally televised blowout loss. All of those things need fixing. Not some of them, all of them. And they needed to start fixing them yesterday, because the rest of the WNBA is not waiting around for Indiana to figure it out. Stephanie White has been given every resource. She has the player, she has the roster, she has the contract security. Now she has the public accountability moment that every coach eventually faces. The moment where the world watched her and her franchise player argue on the bench and then watched the team lose by 16 anyway. What she does with that moment, how she responds, how she adjusts, how she rebuilds the visible trust between herself and Clark in the next few games, that will define this season more than any single statistic. The Fever are 4-4. The season is young. The window is not closed. But the window is absolutely cracked, and whether Stephanie White and Caitlin Clark can seal it back up before the whole thing shatters. That is the story of the 2026 Indiana Fever. And we are just 8 games into it. Dre's final take is this. Clark was not perfect on Saturday. 5 fouls, 1 for 7 from the field. She admitted herself the rotations were slow, which means she is self-aware enough to understand that the whole collapse was not on White alone. Clark's inability to stay out of foul trouble is real. Her defensive lapses are real. And her decision to publicly critique the rotation timing at the podium, while completely understandable given her frustration, is the kind of move that forces a coach to either stand firm or concede, and neither option looks great when you are 4-4 in a championship window. This situation does not have one villain and one hero. It has 2 proud, competitive, frustrated people who want desperately to win, who are not currently winning, and who let the world see their friction in the worst possible moment. That is human. That is sports. But it is also a warning shot, and if Indiana does not answer that warning shot with wins, the conversation we are having today is going to look like the warm-up act compared to what comes next. You already know what it is. Street Hoops does not sugarcoat anything, we do not do PR spin, we do not sanitize the drama to make organizations comfortable. We call it exactly how it is. So if you want the no-filter Indiana Fever coverage, if you want to be in the room when the real conversations happen, you already know what to do. Smash that like button right now. It takes 2 seconds and it means everything to this channel's growth. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to know whether you think Saturday night was just competitive frustration boiling over, or whether you think there is something deeper and darker going on inside that Fever organization. And if you are not subscribed to Street Hoops yet, I genuinely do not know what you are waiting for. New content dropping constantly. No fluff, no filler. Just the real story. I am Dre Fiver. This is Street Hoops. We out.